Hello, and welcome to the Project Good podcast. I'm your host, Annmarie Hylton. Project Good is a social impact podcast interviewing experts and advocates about the pressing problems that we face globally and hearing how they suggest we move forward in the future. The Project Good podcast is brought to you by Project Good Work. The goal of this podcast is to inspire people and organizations to develop a mindset that can move others to positive action regarding the complex social issues facing people and the planet. For April, we're focusing on the future of farming. How did that apple, orange, or steak arrive on your plate? It is increasingly becoming important and costly. Farming remains vital for feeding the world, supporting economies, preserving the environment, and sustaining societies. At its core, farming provides food that sustains the global population. Despite advancements in technology and industry, we are still relying on agricultural practices to produce crops, livestock, and other food products. Without farming, we would not have the resources to feed billions of people. Agriculture is a significant driver of many economies, especially in developing countries. It provides livelihoods for millions of people, from small-scale farmers to large-scale agricultural enterprises. In more industrialized countries, farming out-contributes to employment and overall economies. Farming plays an essential role in land management and ecosystems. Sustainable farming practices can help preserve biodiversity, soil health, and water quality. It also has the potential to combat climate change. Modern farming has become increasingly high-tech with innovations in crop genetics, automation, precision agriculture. This allows farmers to increase productivity, reduce waste, address challenges like climate change or food insecurity in more sustainable ways. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Jesse Hirsh, who is a futurist, speaker, consultant, and goat herd, who brings an outside perspective operating from his farm in rural eastern Ontario. Yet it's no ordinary farm. Wired with high-speed fiber optic internet, the Academy of the Impossible engages in a wide variety and range of research regarding agriculture, media, technology, and culture. With almost 30 years of professional experience, Jesse Hirsh is a broadcaster, researcher, public speaker, and internet evangelist in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. He's appeared on CBS Radio and has a weekly spot on CBC News World where he explains and analyzes trends and developments in technology. He co-hosts an interface show on Omni Television called 3D Dialogue. Jesse has an infectious energy that lifts spirits and enables creative thinking. He's always learning, sharing, and helping others do the same. Let's get into the interview. Many experts believe that the modern food systems are facing significant challenges. While our agricultural practices and food production have advanced dramatically over the years, several factors are putting modern food systems at risk. Some of the key reasons are climate change, soil erosion and loss of fertility, biodiversity, food insecurity, supply chain vulnerabilities, water scarcity, inefficiency and waste, social and economic inequality. Jesse Hirsh has taken a personal responsibility in his life of blending farming and technology and will be giving us insight into how the world of farming is changing. Welcome, Jesse.
Hi.
Hi. It's a pleasure to have you on today. I want to ask kind of a fun question before we get into the interview. And also because I was looking at some of your pictures in preparing for this interview, why goat herding?
Goats are fantastic animals. They're close friends of mine, I'm happy to say, and their personality, I think, not only reflects my own, but inspires me as a human, as a goat herd, to, wake up every day and hang out with them and have good times with them. And there's a lot of ways to describe farmers. There's a lot of ways to describe people who, while having the option of living in the city, consciously choose to live closer to nature and live with animals. And while I have lots of different animals, both in our herd and in our flock, goats are the ones I think I identify with most. So that's why the phrase goat herd, most people are more familiar with shepherd. But goat herd is equally valid, perhaps ancient phrase that I quite like to associate myself with.
Yes, I haven't been a shepherd or a goat herder, but I don't know. I think maybe goats are easier than sheep, or I'm just basing this on looking at the animals. Sheep always seem docile and a little bit clueless, and goats are out to go get that food or, out to explore. So totally different.
Well, and to your point, goats are incredibly intelligent and incredibly disobedient in that if you think about them as a model of leadership, they will only do what they want to do. And you not only have to understand what it is they want to do, you have to align your interests with their interests. And so I think this kind of anti-authoritarian animal is something that most people don't think can be herded. Most people don't think they can be controlled. And in fact, a lot of farmers bail on raising goats because they are so difficult to contain. They're great at escaping. They're great at climbing and getting over fences. So it's a bit of a humble brag to say that you're a goat herd, because it says that, while herding cats is one level of difficulty, herding goats is an entirely different feat.
Yeah, when you were talking about goats climbing, it reminded me of seeing goats in trees in Africa hanging out like their leaves, but here they are goats. That was very interesting how you decided to take that up, considering your background. But also, I think it's giving you kind of a different, I guess, inspiration of education, because you're dealing with things that are, I guess, people and life and the planet, which is not controllable. So I guess it gives you kind of that feeling like, you can only control so much. And so speaking of that now, and going into a little bit about farming, I guess, how did you, or why, I guess let's start with why did you decide to pick up farming in the first place?
I mean, I was a futurist before I was a farmer. And as a futurist, part of what you're tasked to do is really think about what's coming next. And most of the time you're doing that for clients. So you're doing that to help them anticipate their future rather than your own. But the more that I connected the dots, the more I wanted to be in control of my own food supply, the more that I wanted to be closer to nature, the more that I wanted to be outside of cities when it comes to both managing my own quality of life, but also feeling like I had agency, feeling like I had the ability to make a difference, albeit maybe a small one. And finally, the other aspect to that was recognizing how much the urban-rural divide really defines our politics of this moment, that we have a very divided society. And while that division manifests in all sorts of different ways, the difference between urban and rural communities struck me as not only a huge gap, but one that is quite easy to bridge just by traveling, just by moving. And so as someone who spent most of my life living in the city, I decided about 8 years ago that I would be far happier living on a farm, doing farm work. And I'm grateful I made that choice. I only wish I'd made it sooner.
Yes, it seems to be, I guess, a trend for people who have, I don't know, I guess I'm going to use this word, and it's, but I'm using it in a different way, and I'll explain. I guess the people who have waken up, not woke everyone, the people who have waken up into their, I guess, humanity in a sense, that they are looking at everything, I guess, in their lives holistically. And I guess this has become even more popular, obviously, after we all spent our time locked down in a pandemic, right? We really had that time to, look at ourselves for years and see what are we doing? Where am I going? What's my purpose? And so this seems to be, I guess, definitely a trend I'm seeing here in the U.S., and I'm sure you've been seeing that in Canada as well. Is that true?
I mean, yes and no. I think it was. I think the pandemic is a very divisive event, and I think to your point, I think, quite frankly, you did give the definition of woke, that it does mean to be awake and to be holistic. Unfortunately, the word has become weaponized. And I don't claim to be woke, but I do try to be aware of what's happening around me. I almost guiltily confess that I quite enjoyed the pandemic because I was already on a farm and life didn't really change for me. And everything sort of seemed to go really terrible for everyone else. And I empathize. But at the same time, I think what we have seen is a rise of conspiracy, a rise of disinformation, a movement against science. And because I was already in a farming community, I was already in a rural community, it was actually quite shocking to me to see how many farmers embraced ideas that are quite frankly the opposite of farming, the opposite of science, the opposite of having a sustainable relationship with nature. So it feels very discordant to me. It feels very conflicted internally. And I think in terms of our conversation today about the future of farming, that may be a recurring thread or a recurring theme because we are in a society of conflicts. And I think one of the biggest conflict is people's relationship with nature, whether it's the food they eat or whether it's where they live. And to your point, I think a lot of people in the pandemic wanted to be closer to nature. They didn't want to be locked up in an apartment building or, in an urban environment where there isn't a lot of green space. But I think a lot of people have forgotten that now that they are able to go back into their regular routines. So I'm curious personally as to whether we continue to move forward, how many more people get into gardening, for example, or start striking up relationships with farmers so that they're buying their food more direct instead of from the grocery. And whether that continues, I hope it does, but that's kind of in the wait and see category.
Yes. And speaking of that, that leads to the question kind of, do you feel or, experts are saying that our food system is in danger. And so since you're literally, pun intended and not unintended, on the ground, would you say that, are you seeing that our food system is in danger, or is it something that's hyped up because we don't have, or I would say majority of the people living in cities and away from the farm don't have, direct access to see or, I guess, to see it in person? Is this something that we're being told, or do you actually see it on the farm?
Well, I think paradoxically, it's both. On the one hand, I think the danger is underestimated. I think it's in fact quite greater than people realize. Before I became a farmer and I was very much interested in climate change and climate advocacy, I met with a farmer who said, "Hey, we don't need to worry about the cities flooding. We're all going to starve way before then." And I think people really don't appreciate how brittle our food system is and how easy, as we saw in the pandemic with supply chains breaking, our food supply chains can easily break. Eggs, for example, are starting to become almost a luxury item because of the way in which avian influenza is really making it difficult for traditional poultry producers to do their jobs. So on the one hand, yes, it's incredibly dangerous, but on the other hand, the solution's quite accessible. When I was living in the city, I spent a year living in a condo, a glass condo, and I grew a tremendous amount of tomatoes and peppers and other kind of vegetables. And I calculated that if, the condo board, if they stipulated that every south facing or every east or west facing unit that got enough sun had to grow a certain quota of vegetables and then make those vegetables available to the building, let alone selling them to neighbors nearby, they would easily produce enough food to feed the building and then some. And it's that attitude, it's the idea that someone else is going to grow my food is, I think, part of the problem. And I think if we do start embracing gardening, if we do start embracing a more cooperative approach to food production, then it'll be really easy to solve the challenges and dangers we face. Unfortunately, that's still theoretical. That's still something that's only happening in certain communities. It's not happening at the scale necessary to feed everybody.
And yes, and you know what? Because I was thinking of two different things, right? When you were talking, having everyone, I guess, start to participate, I guess, in their own life and survival, their own survival through food, like they used to, I guess, as they would say in the olden days, right? If you as they would say, if you weren't willing to work, you don't eat, right? And so, getting people, I guess, motivated to think about their own, I guess, substance and sustainability and realize that they are, I guess I have no better way to put it, responsible for themselves as they should be. Getting people to take that up, but then there's also, as you were mentioning before, there's this push against the whole kind of science, and I guess a little bit of as we're going to dive into the technological aspect. So I guess getting people to embrace to me, I'm having a hard time framing the question because it's like farming itself is science to me, right? So it's hard for me to imagine that people, I guess they're just so out of touch of, I guess, who and what we are these days that they don't realize that we are essentially the planet, and the planet is us, because that's how you're growing. You put food in your mouth that's coming from the ground, and then it recycles out of you, right? And it's a continuous cycle. So I don't know. I guess let me ask the question: how do you think that we got here? That people became so disconnected from what it is to be part of the planet and human?
I think the short answer is the industrial process, in part because the industrial process and mechanization is inherently the opposite of, the word you used earlier, which is holistic. It's designed on trying to break down and isolate each step of the process without asking the question, what does this impact the whole? What does this impact to the environment? What does this impact to the future? And that industrial logic focuses primarily on growth, on efficiency, on optimization. And so you have a farming practice which is based on doing everything as large as you can, as heavily as you can, to get the biggest profits you can, the biggest yields you can. And there's no room to question it, because the way in which farmers are exploited, like farmers on the one hand can be incredibly wealthy in the sense that they have land and they have equipment and they have access to capital, but they're also highly exploited in that all of the things they have depend upon promises they've made to other people, like banks and equipment manufacturers and seed companies or food or meat distributors. So they get locked into a logic. They get locked into a system. And the flip side to this is farming is not an easy industry to enter. Like, on the one hand, we were talking about how gardening is really quite accessible. Anyone can start gardening. But farming is actually incredibly difficult to get into. The cost of land is inflated. It's incredibly expensive. The cost of equipment, the cost of inputs, the cost of everything is inflated. I've often heard farmers sort of describe that farming is all about buying retail and selling wholesale, which is the opposite of any other business where you buy wholesale and sell retail. This is the inverse. And so it's very difficult for farmers to make any money. And so consequently, most farmers, most people who are in the industry were born there, or maybe they married in, but they have the farm because their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, maybe even their great-great-grandparents started in farming, and they survived all sorts of crises, all sorts of shady situations, bad weather events. And so that makes them a kind of small c conservative, a kind of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, because that's how our parents did it. That's how our grandparents did it. So the industrial process of farming is really kind of culturally baked in. And, where I almost in a derogatory way say some people are anti-science, I don't necessarily mean that they're anti-technology. I just mean that their vision of science, it was back when doctors used to prescribe cigarettes. When, our notion of, say, diesel exhaust was something good to inhale. That science did once long ago tell them those facts. It just so happens that science is dynamic and constantly changing. And if you're not learning and changing with it, it's easy to think that it's good to spray tons of pesticides on your land. It's good to use lots of expensive fertilizer, petroleum-based fertilizer, because it gets you better crops, without thinking what it's doing to your soil, without thinking what it's doing to your neighbor's soil, and without thinking about, the long-term sustainability from a business perspective of one's agricultural practices. And that's one of the biggest reasons that we're in the food crisis we're in, because it's the yield, the return that comes from the industrial process is already diminishing, and it's going to continue to increase in its rate of failing to return. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on an already weak and exploited system, which could create a very precarious food security environment.
Yes. And so in that, one of the things, I'm going to break it down a little bit, is that farmers, and I'm coming from two parents that had that grew up on farms or from farms, even though different countries. So one here in the U.S. and one abroad in Jamaica. And so two different systems completely when it comes to farming, but having that tradition of how farms are passed to children and generations, and then how things are done on the farm. Part of it, I would say, yes, for farmers, there is especially if you, and growing up in a family of farmers, there's, I guess there's a pride of this is our land and this is how we've done things, right? Because maybe you go to the farm, a few miles down and they may grow the same product, but it's a little bit different because that's their stamp. But staying in those traditions because it was their kind of family sealed. So there's that. That is, I guess, comes across in, I guess, a lot of like our traditional professions. I would say similar to teachers, right? And what I mean by that, like when most people that get into like a teaching profession, they have an idea of like, this is how I'm going to do things to, make my difference. And, you get tunnel vision because it is the tradition that you want to follow. But in the fact that through the, I guess, past technologies, mostly I would say through fertilizers and how to speed up the process, because a lot of farmers are put under pressure to be like, okay, last week you did 20 tomatoes, now we need 300. So let's get these plants to produce more. But it's causing a lot of different things. Some other things that I've read about, and I'm sure this is definitely on your radar. There's a loss of the nutritional value, right? That's getting affected. There's some of the seeds that are being given, specifically, I guess you would say the GMO seeds. GMO seeds are not reproducing, so meaning that like if you plant that tomato and then the tomato matures and you go to eat it and then you take those seeds of that tomato, they are not then producing another tomato plant because they become sterile because of how they were treated or harvested or whatever else was going on with the seeds. And so, of course, that becomes problematic because of the way that we used to farm. You would eat something, take the seed, plant it, get another one, and you go on. But because of all the chemicals, like you mentioned, petroleum, that they've been using in farming, which is just like, ironic and not ironic, literally pouring gasoline on our foods or burning it up, which is then burning and killing our soil. So we have like a whole chain reaction that is happening. And so you have been focusing on bringing these new technologies or introducing technologies to the farming industry, or motivating people to look at it differently. I guess how do you start getting these people to think differently?
I mean, quite frankly, you don't. I think there's a real difference between trying to persuade people, which is increasingly, I think, futile, versus providing more sustainable alternatives. And the secret to some of the new farming practices that are sustainable, that are in line with nature, is they are more profitable. They are more prosperous. And that's fundamentally what a lot of farmers focus on. Is they are motivated by the economics. They're certainly motivated by family. They're motivated in many cases by environmental stewardship, but they do need to focus on the bottom line. And that's where a lot of these practices, certainly when it comes to investing in the soil quality, and that's where you get the better nutrients. That's where you get the better nutrition. It's really a reflection of the not just biodiversity, but bacterial health, the extent to which there is the greater number and greater diversity of microbes in the soil that then influences the nutritiousness as well as the yield and the size of whatever it is you're growing. And so it is approaching farming from a holistic perspective. The technology piece for me is a bit of a Trojan horse, in that it's a way to, use the new shiny object as an opportunity to get people thinking about new agricultural practices. But it's also where my strength as a futurist comes in, because it's where I'm anticipating, for example, the role of robotics, the role of AI, the role of technology in, at the very least, fostering a kind of new practice of precision agriculture, where instead of using pesticides, you're identifying the weeds, you're identifying the things on the plants that you don't want to be growing, and you remove them by other means. And the industrial process of agriculture was partly a response, but also partly a creation of the labor shortage that has always plagued agriculture. And on the one hand, we talk about how people left the country to go to the city. Well, part of the reason they did that was city jobs paid better. So you could make more money and potentially lead an easier life working in a factory or working in an office. But historically, agriculture, especially smaller operations, have always had a labor problem. It's why farm families would be larger. They'd have more kids because they needed more people to work there. And they would incentivize those kids by saying, hey, look, you can have the farm when we die. That's part of the reason we're going to exploit you for your entire life. And, that model, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you stood in the family, broke down. And so we still and continue to have a problem with how do we do all the work on the farm. And that's where robots on some levels are kind of appealing. And they have a nice crossover in that they can also enable more sustainable practices, more soil-centric practices, but they also enable a greater understanding of the farm. It allows the farmer to understand their soil. It allows them to understand their livestock. It allows them to understand their crops. So instead of taking the industrial approach, which is, kind of the killing a mosquito with a nuclear bomb, or you're taking a really blunt object approach, when a more surgical approach, a more precision approach is both environmentally sustainable, but often more profitable. So technology allows for the greater feedback loop. It makes it easier for the farmer to understand what they're doing, to see the impact of the choices they make, and therefore make perhaps better choices, more prosperous choices, more sustainable choices. And that's where I sort of say it's a bit of a Trojan horse, that if you look at the kind of narrative of technology that the industry is currently using, it's really about sustaining the industrial model, of allowing the industrial model to get even larger and, dare I say it, even more sinister. But I actually think there's an opportunity to do the opposite, to use the technology to empower smaller farmers and to empower a much more sustainable approach to agriculture in general.
Yes, I started envisioning, because I think in pictures, and it was something actually I had an article that I had read, and they were testing kind of I don't know what the name of the robot is, but essentially they were like making, using like hose and making rows to start planting. And so, I love the approach of using the innovation, and especially now, because it seems, in our new political climate here in the U.S., where many people are getting deported, and a lot of them were people who were working on farms, that this may be something that we need to move on rather quickly in bringing in these innovative ideas, but then also keeping it holistic. So being able to, not throw out a move to produce more, but using it in a healthier way. So just rethinking how we merge our two, I guess you would say, two different worlds, right? Our world of technology with our old ways, and enhance it to make it even a better world that's thinking about us as human beings and what we need from a nutrient value, a sustainability value in regards to, the planet, making sure that, that used to be that you were supposed to rotate your crops so that you didn't, burn out the soil and put nutrients back. And having that technology, I don't know if they have such robots already invented that would be planting, and then tells you don't put a seed in this area of soil because, these beans are not going to grow. Instead, it's time to, throw in some strawberries or something. I'm making that up, not knowing what would be the change, of course, in the soil. But having that ability that we can then, start thinking of ourselves in a healthier way. Now, as you were mentioning before, that you can't necessarily, change how people are thinking. But if you were, I guess, going to, on your farm, start introducing or getting people to take on these things, should we just start implementing just classes worldwide, do you think, little by little, to start opening this up to people? Or do you think that it needs to be just a radical change and just say, okay, look, everyone, we're going to, we have 40 harvests left. If you guys want to be around and not fighting for an apple, it's now or never.
I mean, to my earlier point about how accessible farming as an industry is, it's kind of equivalent to policing, in the sense that there's a long line of people who want to do the job, and there's no reason for us to tolerate the idiots who are currently doing it. And that's not to disparage farmers, whereas I'm absolutely happy to disparage law enforcement officers. I think the solution here is to make it easier for people to become farmers. You don't need to try to change minds. The people who are going about it the old way are going to fail. And unfortunately, we have a system, especially in the United States, where we subsidize failure. Right? We don't allow the big businesses that control much of the industry to fail when they have fundamentally been failing, when instead we should make it easier for new people who want to farm to become farmers, because those are the ones who are going to do the new practices. Those are the ones who are learning, who are gardening, who are really embracing the bleeding edge of scientific and technological research. And to your point about the robots, they already exist. I mean, there are tons and tons of agricultural robots. Every year, there's a couple of events, one in Europe, one in America, that is dedicated to agricultural robotics and feature all sorts of, from small end to high end, farming robots. Again, which are used not just for sustainable practices. Many of them really are designed to enable the industrial practices that are kind of problematic, but are still how we eat. So a lot of the people, to play devil's advocate, who work in that industry would say, well, we're all going to starve without their practices. But I believe we need more farmers, new farmers, creative farmers, farmers who have new ideas, who have ideas that you and I could never imagine. And, given the opportunity, would find really innovative, sustainable ways to work with nature rather than against it. I don't think the issue here is classrooms. I think, as an aside, their current model of education is also broken and obsolete. I think there's a lot of people out there who are eager to teach themselves, who are eager to spend every day learning, because that's what farming is. That's what farming should be. That's what surviving climate change is. It is really about embracing and fostering a kind of curiosity and innovation, which there are so many people in this world who would kill for the opportunity to farm, who would love to be able to apply more sustainable practices to how and where they grow food. But it's the cost of entry that is so prohibitive. So if I were to articulate it in the form of a policy, it would be subsidizing the entry of new farmers into the market rather than subsidizing existing farmers who have bad practices and who are holding on to land that's been in their generation for families because it's very emotional for them. But if, we are to accept that food is a business, and I'm not saying it should be, but if we were to accept that food is a business, then we should allow new entrants into the market, and those new entrants will bring with them new technology and new methodologies.
Yes, I'm for it. I guess I would say I'm for it. I know a lot of people, I have a theory, it hasn't been proven, of course, 100%, but I have a theory that what's really, really, really wrong on the planet is coming directly. It's once again, puns. I like to be a little bit silly and kooky. But at the root of it, I believe it is all these things that we're experiencing in society, I believe, are coming from the ground and what we're eating. I believe that people are not, as mentally, as strong as they used to be, and physically as strong as they used to be, because I believe everything that is coming from the ground, and that it's causing all these unbelievable things that we haven't seen before in society, because it's coming straight from the ground. That's what that's my theory. That's why we have to go back and really look about what's getting into us. Like, as the saying says, you are what you eat, right? So that's my theory about why we've come into chaos. Because I think a majority of the people are not getting what they really need from the ground. Like I said, it might be far-fetched, but that's what I think.
I don't think it's far-fetched, but I would argue the opposite, that the problem is with our politics and our political leaders, and that if we had better political leaders, we'd be eating better food.
This is true, because they would probably care a little bit more about what's going on in the ground.
Well, but also to recognize that all industries are products of their regulations, right? Society is a product of its laws or lack thereof. And so the agricultural sector is very powerful when it comes to lobbying, is very powerful when it comes to legislation. So I don't want to blame consumers for eating the food that they eat, especially if they don't have a lot of money and they're buying food that's cheap. We can legitimately, as many people love to do, blame our politicians. because our food system, like many of our systems, like our response to climate change, is not quote unquote natural. It's not automatic. It's not accidental. It's a byproduct of politics. And so politics is really the place to make any changes to improve our diet or our well-being.
Yes, and right now I think we are in a period of what I would say a time of deep internal work is needed. I think definitely here in the U.S., as we see, there's a lot of I'll just call it chaos because I don't know what else to say anymore. I'll just yeah. So I think it's a time of definitely deep internal self-examination is needed, and to decide where are we going as people. What do we value anymore? Do we value ourselves? Do we value our lives? Do we value our health? Do we value the future? Essentially, right? Do we value the future? Because it seems that we have this thing of we just live for now, and then we stop, and they're like, oh, we can't believe that happened. Well, how can we not believe that happened?
And this is why I think gardening is really powerful, because if your food grows, you can sort of say to yourself, well, I know how that happened. And if the food dies, then you could say, well, how did that happen? Oh, I didn't take care of it. Oh, I didn't water it. Oh, I didn't put the effort in. And it's that relationship with time. And you earlier alluded to responsibility, although I don't think it's personal responsibility. I think it's collective responsibility. Because what I love about living with animals is I am responsible not for them, I'm responsible to them. I have to feed them. If I don't feed them, they will be hungry. They could get sick. So I'm responsible to them in the sense that if I do feed them, well, then they love me and they enjoy hanging out with me. And that brings me happiness and that brings me joy. So there's a much more, to your point, a relationship with the long term, a relationship with consequences, a relationship with responsibility that I think, whether you have pets, whether you have a garden, or whether you just have houseplants, I think that kind of work is really valuable to helping us feel that we can make a difference, that even the small action of watering a plant could result in something that tastes really good and makes us feel nourished and happy. So that to me is a real potential for empowerment, especially on the community level.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, when you were saying about responsibility, it reminds me of like our first job, and I think we just we forgot it, or we got scared, or who knows, a bunch of other things came into effect. But our first job is to be stewards of the planet. And I think, whether you look at it from a, logical or a, religious standpoint, that is our main, our main job. And for some reason, I know a lot of different reasons, but we ran away from that responsibility. And now, as like I was saying, and now we have to face the consequences, and we're like, oh my gosh, and we want to all point a billion fingers in all different directions, but it's time to, in my opinion, quit pointing the fingers and get our hands dirty, and get digging. In closing a little bit, I wanted to ask you a few things about, to give some insight. I'm going to give you a couple just technical quiz questions a little bit. I guess here's one. How do you see genetic engineering and CRISPR technology transferring food production and crop resilience in the future?
It's a kind of double-edged sword. I mean, on the one hand, it has the opportunity to give us a greater understanding, a greater awareness of why certain crops, certain animals, certain breeds, certain species flourish the way they do or suffer the way they do. And while we are going to face a lot of challenges in terms of a volatile climate cycle, in terms of sometimes wetter summers or drier parts of the seasons in terms of floods and droughts and extreme heat. So there is certainly a role to that level of genetic hacking to make some of our crops, make some of our animals a little more resistant. But the danger is that if it becomes a tool for short-term gain at the expense of kind of long-term sensibilities, then we could be making the situation worse. And it goes into that adage of with great power comes great responsibility. And once we enter the world of genetics and gene hacking, that is a lot of power. So I think it is helpful when it comes to understanding, when it comes to science, when it comes to appreciating our relationship with nature. But I think if we retain a position of arrogance, if we retain a position of superiority, that we can use these tools to one up or best nature, then that unfortunately is going to lead to negative consequences.
Yes, I think, it reminds me like the stepping a little bit away from farming, but it's like these modified foods or food. Have you heard of things like, I'm sure you've heard of like you can create food out of different proteins in the air. Have you heard of the air protein of making food like out of, I guess, non-food items? So
I mean,
I know as a farmer, you're probably like, no,
well,
don't eat it. Don't
everything,
eat it. Yeah.
On the contrary, everything gets lost in translation because, when you hear people say, oh, I don't want to eat that food, it's got chemicals. Well, everything is made of chemicals. Like all food is chemicals. Water is hydrogen and oxygen. And farming as a practice or as like a scientific methodology, it's been messing with nature for hundreds and hundreds of years. Some of those experiments were really good. Some of those experiments were not so good. So none of this is clear cut. And I think the larger issue is kind of, if we were to use a rule, it would be local. And I say this in the sense of, even if the food is produced in a quasi-synthetic or quasi-artificial manner, if the ingredients of that food comes from local soil, comes from local animals, comes from local whatever, then that is fundamentally the best thing for our health. It's the eating food that is not connected to where we live, where we breathe, and the microbes and all the viruses and bacteria that make us up. That's where things get a little sketchy. But there is now, thanks to technology, a lot of gimmicks, a lot of wild ideas. It's possible some of these wild ideas may actually feed humanity. So that's where I'm always, on the one hand, cautious and skeptical about, I don't know. But on the other hand, I'm like, well, maybe there is some young person now who's got some crazy idea that's going to radically increase the food supply as we know it. So that's where I think the moral here is, if you don't have a few farmers as friends, you ought to. Because even if you don't agree with their politics, you're still going to learn from them in terms of where your food comes from and how to eat as healthy as possible. Because no one actually has the answer. But the more people you talk to, the more likely you're able to make up your mind in a way that's going to benefit you.
Yes, and one more technical one, which kind of layers on this one, and in a way you've answered it a bit. But how do you see blockchain technology reshaping the agricultural supply and enhancing transparency, traceability, and trust between farmers and consumers? Because one of the biggest things is, I'm in California, so we're always like, where did this come from? And, we have our labels on our food. We want to know the nutrients. California is, maybe an outlier because, in California, we're always thinking about oh, is this what we're eating? Is this almonds from here and there? We're a little bit more, I would say, particular. So we're maybe we're the outliers. Outliers are a little bit not your typical, I guess you would say.
I think the technology or the desire for traceability and transparency in the food system is going to increase radically. I think even consumers today who are content to be completely oblivious as to where their food comes from, I think they are also going to start to expect it. But more importantly, it's the producers and the distributors who are going to demand for that level of transparency and traceability. And maybe 5 years ago or even 10 years ago, I think blockchain was a viable candidate to play that role. But I'm not sure it's legitimate anymore. And I think there is a growing constituency within the technology world who feel that blockchain is just a scam, a complete and total catastrophe. So I don't think it's really going to get the consensus or the credibility required in a matter of trust, because that is fundamentally what we're talking about. Is the system of transparency and traceability is designed to foster greater trust of the food supply system. And I think that inherently disqualifies blockchain and all associated technologies presently. But I do think that there are currently other technologies that are competing to provide this role and are aspiring to be a kind of infrastructure when it comes to food security and food traceability. And I think it's generally something that'll be beneficial for farmers and consumers alike. But I don't think it'll be blockchain. And if it is blockchain, it'll be an absolute disaster.
Now, a little bit of a global question because, we've been talking about technology and looking at food in the U.S. and Canada. Now, for developing countries, are experiencing, multiple range of, different experiences. Some of them, depending on, how bad the situation is, may be reliant on GMO seeds being sent to them. I had some people that I've worked on a couple projects with in like East Africa and talking about, soil burnout and things like that. So how, I guess, in these regions that, have not been, shared, technology has not necessarily been shared, but desperately need to see a change because they've had populations there for hundreds, if not, thousands of millions of years. How do we start introducing these types of regions to this technology, or how does this technology get introduced to them so that they can get out of the situations of, famine?
So I have a lot of difficulties with how you frame that question,
Okay.
in part because it enables a kind of technological colonialism that I think none of those countries desire.
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, the state of the food security system globally is a consequence of politics and economics, not so much technology. And certainly in a lot of, again, I think developing countries is itself a kind of political phrase. So I'll say in a lot of countries that are not North American, European, especially in South America, but especially in Africa, there is tremendous technological innovation. And the kinds of technology, the kinds of tools that they are using are incredibly advanced. I would argue in many cases more advanced than a lot of farmers are using here in North America. Part of the geopolitical dynamics of this, of course, is China. China is one of the world's leading technology manufacturers globally. And they create a lot of agricultural technology, especially drones. And the role of drones in agriculture, especially Chinese drones in agriculture, has been quite revolutionary. So a lot of this technology is available in what's often referred to as the global south. The larger issues for those farmers are more like access to markets, right? And ability to get proper prices or collective bargain for their crops. But then, of course, the other issue is land ownership. Land ownership here in North America is a huge obstacle to agriculture. Land ownership in the global south is also a huge obstacle because of the colonial past, because of the political past. As much as technology can play a very powerful role in making food cheaper, in making food safer, in making the role of farming more sustainable and happy, it's really about accessibility to the industry and not so much about accessibility to the technology. Because a flip side to this is there is a lot of free and open source technology that is applied to agriculture, both in terms of farming robots, but in terms of some of the Internet of Things and some of the other kind of technological applications, even AI. Really the issue with farming has always been and will probably always be access to land. Not so much access to technology. And then once you have access to land, access to collective projects like irrigation, like solar power, like water rationing. These are, again, all political issues, not so much technological issues. And that's where I think it's worth pointing out that there's no such thing as a neutral technology. Technologies themselves are very political. And that's where, one of the underlying, I think, visions of farming that we've been talking about today has been industrial farming versus sustainable farming. Well, the industrial farming model is big tractors and big combines. Well, what if in the sustainable farming model, you got little robots that, don't have the same impact on the soil, don't require the same amount of diesel fuel or energy consumption, but you can have way more of them and they can do many tasks and allow those tasks to be done in coordination and through networking. Again, these are models that are being tried by farmers, that are being experimented really around the world. It's just, it's something most people just don't pay attention to because they take for granted where their food comes from.
Yes. And so, and I wanted to make sure that we touched a little bit on the global market of farming, because we definitely see that it's different in each region. Not farming and growing itself, but yes, exactly, having access to these technologies so that the difference can be made, and then they can get the food that is needed. And then, of course, as the other thing is that people always think that there's not enough food in the world, but there is. It's just about distribution. So same thing. And then for, I guess, my closing question to you, how would, I guess, your everyday person, I guess, start to, I guess, move into a new way of thinking about farming? And how do we start, I guess, just pushing ourselves to where we need to be? Or I guess maybe I should ask, where do you think that we need to be in order to be okay 5 years from now? And that's a big question. I know I always call these my kind of beauty passion questions because it's hard to predict.
I think it's important to recognize that there's no such thing as individuals, and that if we were individuals, we would starve. We certainly experience life as individuals, but we fundamentally live in community, and the only way that we're able to feed is by helping each other. So on the one hand, I encourage people to garden, and if gardening is not your thing, help someone else who has a garden. Ask them what help they need, what work they could do, or just chat with them about their garden so that they have time to talk about it and feel as if they're doing something valuable. If you want to level up beyond that, make friends with a farmer. And thanks to the technology of social media, there are now a lot of farmers who are online, who are on YouTube, who are on Instagram, who are on TikTok, who have their own websites, and they want to be your friend. They want to connect with people who eat their food or who want to learn how their food is produced. And it's that kind of direct learning that I think benefits not just the people who eat the food, it benefits the farmers as well, because they get into a kind of conversation with their community, with their consumers. So I think it's important to be more active in understanding where your food comes from, but more importantly, to put labor into where your food comes from. And finally, for a lot of people, that means spending more time making your food. I think maybe we take for granted how easy it is to buy food that's finished, that's already prepared, rather than putting in labor and joy into making your food. It doesn't have to be complicated. You don't need to make anything fancy, but there is a satisfaction. There is a joy in eating food you've made, let alone eating food that you've grown and made. So I think that kind of food for the soul, that kind of healing practice is something everyone can benefit from.
I love how you call it food for the soul. Bringing back when we go back to, I guess farming was about community. So perfect response. If you have, one thing, this is a fun question. I wanted to ask you, if you have one thing that you love planting, what would you say is something that you love to plant?
Jalapenos.
And why?
I love to eat them.
You just eat them plain, or do you put them in things, or all of
I
it?
use them, all of the above. I make hot sauces. I eat them plain. I cook them as parts of other foods. I make other peppers, but jalapenos are kind of the staple, in part because I live fairly north, and they are easier to grow in my climate compared to other peppers.
Okay. It seems that you should, become a Californian then.
I would, except, you guys don't have a lot of water, and you need water for a lot of these things.
Yes,
and
we did.
I happen to live in a very water-rich part of the world.
So you want to make sure that you can still drink, survive, and have some other stuff, as we're unfortunately always burning down here, but it is still beautiful.
No doubt.
Thank you, Jesse, for your time and insight. To learn more about Jesse Hirsh, go to jessehirsh.com. If you have a passion for an unserved community, a social justice problem, or want to change minds, contact Project Good Work at projectgood.work to start your project of change today. Subscribe to our mailing list at projectgood.work/subscribe to get our episodes and blog articles sent to you each month. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to Project Good, where we're focused on what matters.